So this lecture is meant to accompany your reading and our discussion of Ernest Becker's work, The Denial of Death. I first came across this book when I was an undergraduate taking a course in comparative religions at LSU. My bachelor's degree actually is in mathematics, but at the time I was taking lots of courses in lots of different subjects, and so comparative religions looked interesting, and so that's basically how I discovered anthropology. Anyway, of course, I read through the book. The classroom discussion helped a lot. The class was taught by one of my favorite professors, Dr. Richardson, who has since passed at LSU. And of course, it was a difficult read. I was an undergraduate, but I could just sense that there was something fundamental there, particularly after our discussions in the classroom concluded on the book. So when I was a graduate student, and by this time I had sort of switched my discipline interest away from mathematics to anthropology. And so as a graduate student in anthropology, working on my master's degree, I picked it up and read through it again. And I began to quote-unquote get it after my second full reading. And then once I became a professor teaching courses, I decided to use the book in my Introduction to Religious Studies classes I was teaching at LSU at the time. I was in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at LSU. And so, of course, as preparation for the course, I read through it once again. And I have to say, at this point, this book has been the number one influence regarding how I think about culture and also religion in regard to what is it that motivates us to be like we are, to believe the things we do, to do the things we do, etc. So in my mind, this book has been the greatest influence on my thinking in regard to just generally cultural and religious behavior. Now, so I know Becker's been a bit difficult for some of you, but you'll find that as you get into the material, you will grasp more and more of what he's saying, obviously. But, you know, at the heart of it, there's just a few really kernel ideas. And once you have been exposed enough to Becker, you can pick up on those ideas. And you can begin to see the world the way he sees it. But it does take a certain amount of exposure to get to that point. So I certainly would encourage you, please make sure you do the reading. That is crucial here. Make sure you do the reading. And then, of course, I also have those YouTube videos posted for you, which do a really great job of summarizing Becker's ideas. And then, of course, I'm providing these lectures for you, either 2 or 3 part, depending on how long it takes me to get through them, to help you with Becker. And if once you get through all this material, it should be clear to you why this book and Becker's ideas are important in an anthropology of religion course, because he gives us one of the more creative ways to understand not only the origin of religions, but why people are religious at all. In fact, he gives us what I think is the most plausible answer regarding those questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the book, and in each chapter I'm just going to focus on a couple of significant ideas that he puts forth. The end result of all this being sort of like a very, very brief thumbnail summary of the text. All right, a few preliminary comments before we get going. Just along the lines of an introduction to Becker's work. Becker would say that birth, sickness, old age, death, these things represent the truth of reality, the actual, real, natural world we live in. The other things we engage in, cultural things, religion, gender, our ideas regarding race, sexuality, language, all those cultural things, all those represent hope. And of course, his point here is that culture is actually, well, it's some sort of facsimile of nature, but even that word is too strong. Because culture, in fact, tries to shield us, religion tries to shield us from the quote-unquote terrors and uncertainty of nature. So in that way, we can say culture or religion is flawed because they give us a really poor view of natural reality, as we would call it. In the preface, he notes that the concern with death, the anxiety and the fear, is a universal phenomenon. Right? We find it in all peoples. That's an attempt by Becker to sort of justify his reliance on death as being such a prime mover in regard to human cultural behavior. All cultures deal with death in their own way, with incredibly elaborate burial rituals, for example. They differ in regard to how they deal with it, but they all do deal with it in some way. In other words, all cultures culturize death. No culture as a culture or no religion as a religion simply accepts death as the final act in a person's life. But he also notes that philosophies such as materialism, the idea that the physical, tangible world is all that exists. In other words, there's nothing beyond this. There's no heaven, hells, angels, demons, etc. That's materialism. Also, we have humanists, we have existentialists, we have agnostics, we have atheists. So the very existence of these individuals demonstrate the fact that not everyone is buying into what Becker would call the cultural lie or the cultural fantasy. It's probably a better way to put it. Okay, chapter 1, Human Nature and the Heroic. Here he focuses on heroism and what it means in the context of his ideas. Hopefully you watched the second video, YouTube video, that was posted on heroism. You'll find that to be very helpful. And he notes in chapter 1 that Part of humankind's tragic destiny is our urge to heroism. Right? We feel as if we're not just insignificant animals, right? Procreating, growing old, getting sick, and dying. Right? In the face of this physicality, in the face of this finitude, we just insist on the fact that we count, we mean something, we matter, right? We have meaning and purpose that transcends our mere physicality, that transcends our finitude. And it's heroism that helps us transcend our physicality, that helps transcend our finitude. And of course, this comes in a variety of forms, and those were discussed in the video. Okay, I'm reading from page 4, from the bottom paragraph on page 4, then going over to page 5. The fact is that this is what society is and always has been: a symbolic action system, a structure of statuses and roles, customs and rules for behavior designed to serve as a vehicle for earthly heroism. Each script is somewhat unique. Each culture has a different hero system. What the anthropologists call cultural relativity is thus the relativity of hero systems around the world over. But each cultural system is a dramatization of earthly heroics. Each system cuts out roles for performances of various degrees of heroism, from the high heroism of a Churchill, a Mao, or a Buddha, to the low heroism of the coal miner, the peasant, the simple priest, the plain, everyday, earthy heroism wrought by gnarled working hands, guiding a family through hunger and disease. It doesn't matter whether the cultural hero system is frankly magical, religious, and primitive, or secular, scientific, and civilized. It is still a mythical hero system in which people serve in order to earn a feeling of primary value, of cosmic specialness, of ultimate usefulness to creation, of unshakable meaning. And so that's what our culture gives us. So culture is our means to live heroically. Our religion gives us a means to live heroically. In other words, to stand tall and proud and defiant in the face of mortality and nature. But this raises an issue with some folks. After all, if we're putting all of our, we can call them psychological or intellectual eggs in this one basket, well, quite naturally, the question regarding how empirically true is this cultural system, this question is going to come up, right? Because after all, that is our lifeline. That is our life raft, our preserver. So that being the case, how true is it? How valid is it? He closes this chapter with a quote on page 7. And it's on page 7, you'll find under the conclusion, drop down 5 lines. Society itself is a codified hero system, which means that society everywhere is a living myth of the significance of human life, a defiant creation of meaning. It's important that you understand what that means. And this can be said of culture or religion, which is a major subset of culture, is a living myth of the significance of human life. Well, he labels it a mythology because in his mind, it's not empirically true. In other words, it's not making true statements about the world we live in. So that would classify it as a mythology. A mythology that supports the idea that human life is significant. So there's that part. Then the second part, it's a defiant creation of meaning. Well, why is it defiant? It's defiant because it stands over and against the natural order of things. It says no to nature and yes to culture. Okay, in chapter 2, an important idea here is that we can't overlook the importance of the fear of death, particularly in the early hominins. I'm talking about early Homo sapiens before the time of plant and animal domestication, when we were still hunting, gathering, and scavenging. And he says that that's a sensible fear, a very sensible fear that's conducive to biological survival. But this trait has been passed on to such an extent that today, modern man even fears fear. In fact, that's what one way to look at anxiety. We fear fear. And he calls us hyper-anxious animals. So consider the fear of public speaking. Not only might a person have to deal with the anxiety of the actual act itself, standing in front of a group of people trying to express themselves, but humans can actually look ahead and begin to fear the fear that they know they're going to be experiencing while they're publicly speaking. So we fear fear itself. So that's why Becker refers to us as hyper-anxious animals. So what's his point there? Well, we're in dire need of some sort of hero system to help us through this, to give us some sort of psychological comfort. That's his basic point there. Chapter 3. He notes here what he calls the existential paradox of the human condition. And it's important that we understand that. So on the one hand, we're symbolic creatures with the ability to write classical music, to create calculus, produce wonderful works of art, etc. So we're symbolic creatures. But on the other hand, we're just biological animals, procreating, defecating, secreting, eventually dying. So that's the existential paradox. These two human modalities, or I should say these two modalities are found in the very same being, hence the paradox. He often uses the phrase, humans are worms that are destined to become food for worms. And the reason why you see this in the book over and over is that he's trying to drive home the point that it is our physicality, our naturalness, that must be overcome. There's a quote on page 26, beginning with the first indented paragraph. We might call this the existential paradox, the condition of individuality within finitude. Man has a symbolic identity that brings him sharply out of nature. He's a symbolic self, a creature with a name, a life history. He's a creator with a mind that soars out to speculate about atoms and infinity, who can place himself imaginatively at a point in space and contemplate bemusedly his own planet. And so this gives us, he writes, the status of a small god in nature. But then the other side of the coin, yet at the same time, man is a worm and food for worms. This is the paradox. He is out of nature and hopelessly in it. He is dual, up in the stars and yet housed in a heart-pumping, breath-gasping body that once belonged to a fish and still carries the gill marks to prove it, etc. All right, a little bit further down in the chapter, he notes that it is culture that isolates us from a true awareness of our finitude. In other words, culture protects us from a true awareness of our predicament. Culture helps us think everything is okay when really it's not, because we haven't really solved the problem of nature and mortality. Okay, so we're still discussing Chapter 3. I'm going to stop the lecture there before it gets too long, and we'll pick it up in Part 2.